Welcome to Shattered Sky Stories. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button so you don't miss any sci-fi stories. Now sit back and enjoy. In the abyssal darkness of Europa's crushing depths, where no light had ever touched stone, Dr. Jonah Sagan pressed his palm against the reinforced titanium glass observation port and felt the entire colony shudder. Not from seismic activity, the sensors would have screamed warnings. Not from pressure variance, the atmospheric processors hummed their steady, mechanical lullaby. This was something else entirely. The vibration passed through his bones like a tuning fork struck against the fundamental frequency of existence itself. In that moment, every piece of recording equipment in Bathysphere Station went silent. Every hydrophone array extending into the midnight ocean ceased its vigilant listening. Every quantum processor tasked with deciphering the Leviathan's eternal songs simply stopped. And in that impossible silence, Jonah heard something that should not have existed. The sound of his own name, spoken in a voice older than worlds, rising from depths that his instruments claimed were empty. The voice spoke not through water or metal or air, but directly into the marrow of his understanding, bypassing his ears entirely. When the instruments flickered back to life 3 minutes and 17 seconds later, they had recorded nothing. Nothing except a single impossible reading on the gravitational sensors. A momentary spike that suggested something the size of a small moon had brushed against their detection grid, then vanished without trace. Jonah stared into the black water and knew, with the terrible certainty of revelation, that everything was about to change. Dr. Jonah Sagan had come to Europa carrying only 2 possessions of true value: a dog-eared copy of Melville's Moby Dick and the weight of a reputation destroyed by truth. The book, printed on actual paper in an age that had forgotten the texture of wood pulp, rested now beside his workstation in the linguistics lab, its pages yellowed by the recycled atmosphere of humanity's deepest outpost. He often read passages aloud to the empty laboratory, his voice joining the mechanical symphony of air processors and pressure regulators that kept their fragile bubble of warmth and breath intact beneath 4 kilometers of alien ice water. "And I only am escaped alone to tell thee," he would whisper, the words of Job's messenger echoing through chambers where no human ear remained to hear them. The irony was not lost on him. Jonah, named for the prophet swallowed by Leviathan, had himself been cast into the belly of the deepest ocean in the solar system, exiled not by divine mandate but by the inexorable machinery of academic disgrace. 3 years ago, his groundbreaking paper on cetacean consciousness had been published in Nature Xenolinguistics to international acclaim. 6 months later, when his follow-up research suggested that Earth's whales possessed not merely intelligence but active memory of humanity's pre-industrial past, the scientific community had closed ranks against him with surgical precision. Anthropomorphic delusion, the review boards had concluded. Projection of human narrative frameworks onto animal behavioral patterns. The grant money evaporated. The teaching positions disappeared. His research was quietly archived in the subspecialty databases where failed hypotheses went to die. But Dr. Sarah Hadley, administrator of Bathysphere Station, had seen something else in his work. "I need someone who understands that intelligence doesn't always speak our language," she had told him during their encrypted video interview, her angular face pixelated by the quantum relay delay between Earth and Jupiter's orbit. "Someone who can listen to what doesn't want to be heard." Europa's ocean held secrets that made terrestrial cetacean behavior seem simple by comparison. The Leviathans, massive, bioelectric entities that drifted through the moon's global sea like living continents, produced complex acoustic patterns that had puzzled xenolinguists for 2 decades. Previous researchers had cataloged the sounds, mapped their frequencies, analyzed their mathematical relationships, but none had succeeded in extracting meaning from the endless, mournful songs that rose from the ocean's deepest trenches. Jonah had been on Europa for 18 months when he first understood that the songs were not random. Working alone in the pre-dawn hours of the station's artificial day cycle, he had isolated a recurring pattern in the acoustic data, a mathematical relationship that suggested not mere communication but active narration. The Leviathans were telling stories. The discovery should have been cause for celebration. Instead, it filled him with a creeping dread that he could not name. There was something in the cadence of those songs, something in their recursive mathematical structure, that reminded him of mourning rituals, of elegies, of memorial services for the dead. "You're hearing things that aren't there," Dr. Hadley had said when he presented his preliminary findings. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of an administrator who had seen too many researchers break under the pressure of deep space isolation. "Pattern recognition is a survival trait, Jonah. Sometimes we find patterns even in chaos. but the patterns were too consistent, too deliberate. Late at night, when the station's skeleton crew settled into their sleep cycles and the laboratory fell silent except for the distant hum of life support, Jonah would don his headphones and lose himself in the Leviathan's endless recitations. Through layers of quantum-enhanced audio processing, he could hear the shape of grammar, the rhythm of syntax, the rise and fall of narrative structure. They were not simply communicating. They were preserving. And what they preserved, Jonah began to realize, was a history of loss so vast that it dwarfed human comprehension. The insight came to him on a Tuesday in the small hours of Europa's 36-hour day, as he listened to a sequence of songs recorded near the Connemara Chaos region. The acoustic pattern suddenly resolved into clarity, like a xenolingual Rosetta Stone unlocking itself in his mind. The songs weren't random because they weren't songs at all. They were verses of an epic poem, passed down through generations of creatures whose memory stretched back geological ages. And they were singing about the end of the world. Jonah's hands shook as he saved the translation matrix to encrypted storage. The fragments he had decoded painted a picture of Europa before the Leviathans, when the moon's ocean had teemed with a civilization whose achievements made human technology seem like crude stone tools. A civilization that had mastered the forces that held atoms together and learned to sculpt spacetime like clay. A civilization that had made a mistake so profound that it had drawn the attention of something that dwelt between the stars. The mistake was coming home. Jonah's first instinct was to present his findings to Dr. Hadley immediately. His second instinct, honed by years of academic betrayal, was to verify everything twice before trusting anyone else with information that could destroy him. He chose the path of caution, and in doing so, stumbled upon evidence that Bathysphere Station's mission was not what the colonists believed. The official record stated that the station had been established to study Europa's ecosystem and assess the moon's potential for terraforming. But buried in the archived data streams, accessible only through the quantum archaeological techniques he had developed for his cetacean research, Jonah discovered transmission logs that painted a different picture. Bathysphere Station was not a research facility. It was a listening post, and it had been listening for something specific. The classified files, encrypted with algorithms that had taken his linguistic analysis software months to crack, contained fragments of communication between Dr. Hadley and the Hegemony Council on Earth. The transmission spoke of convergence events and temporal resonance patterns, and the necessity of early warning systems for existential threats. Most chilling of all was a reference to Protocol Jonah, a contingency plan that bore his own name and seemed to involve something called prophetic dissolution. They had not chosen him for his expertise in xenolinguistics. They had chosen him because they needed someone who could decode warnings about the end of everything, someone expendable enough to be sacrificed for the knowledge. The realization sent Jonah deeper into the station's forgotten archives, into data chambers that officially did not exist. The Hegemony had built Bathysphere Station on the grave of an earlier colony, one that had been evacuated under circumstances so sensitive that the records had been classified beyond even the highest security clearance. But linguistic analysis left patterns that survived even the most thorough data sanitization, and Jonah had learned to read the ghosts of deleted words. The first colony had been abandoned when its researchers discovered that Europa's Leviathans were not native to the moon. They were refugees, the last survivors of a catastrophe that had consumed their original home. And they had come to Europa carrying a warning about something that followed in their wake. Searching for corroboration, Jonah ventured into the station's deepest levels, where the original foundation had been built into Europa's ice-rock interface. The corridors there smelled of age and abandonment, lit only by emergency luminescence that cast everything in sickly green shadows. In a forgotten storage bay, he found the personal effects of the first colony's researchers, belongings that had been sealed away rather than returned to their families. Among them, he discovered the journal of Dr. Elena Vasquez, the first colony's chief xenobiologist. Her final entries, dated just weeks before the evacuation, described increasingly disturbing behavior among the Leviathans. The creatures had begun to gather in unprecedented numbers, their songs taking on a new urgency. And they had started to exhibit behaviors that suggested they were not merely intelligent, but prescient. They know something is coming, Vasquez had written in her spidery handwriting. Something that makes them afraid. I've never seen evidence of fear in the Leviathans before, but there's no other way to describe what I'm observing. They're preparing. Migrating to the deepest trenches. Singing their stories louder and more frequently, as if they're trying to ensure the knowledge survives whatever's coming. The final entry was a single line, "It's here." Jonah was photographing the journal pages when the attack came. He heard the footsteps too late, soft-soled boots on metal decking, moving with the practiced silence of someone accustomed to killing. The first shot shattered the storage bay's single light fixture, plunging the space into absolute darkness. Training kicked in, not academic training, but the urban survival skills he had learned growing up in the Detroit reclamation zone. Jonah rolled behind a stack of storage crates, drawing the ceramic knife he had learned to carry during his graduate years in Sao Paulo. The weapon felt pitifully inadequate, but it was better than nothing. Dr. Sagan, a voice called from the darkness. Male, professional, tinged with an accent that suggested corporate security training. You've accessed files that are above your clearance level. We need to discuss your research. Discuss. Jonah tried to keep his voice steady. With bullets. Pause. Then laughter, genuinely amused. The first shot was a warning. A demonstration of capability. I could have killed you already if that was my intention. What do you want? To recruit you, the voice said. My name is Marcus Webb. I represent certain interests within the Hegemony Council that are not entirely aligned with Dr. Hadley's interpretation of your mission parameters. A light clicked on, a small hand torch that illuminated a thin, pale man in the black utility jumpsuit of station security. He held a pulse weapon casually, pointed at the floor rather than at Jonah's hiding place. There are factions on Earth that believe Dr. Hadley's approach to the Europa situation is dangerously naive, Webb continued. They sent me to monitor the situation and, if necessary, to ensure that critical information reaches the right people. Jonah remained crouched behind the crates. What kind of information? The kind you've been discovering. The Leviathan's warnings. The nature of what's returning to this system. Webb's voice carried a weight that suggested he knew more than he was revealing. Dr. Hadley believes that if we simply ignore the myths and legends, they'll go away. But you understand that some myths are memories, don't you? How long have you been watching me? Since before you arrived. Your research on terrestrial cetaceans caught someone's attention. Someone who understood that your theories about deep time memory in aquatic species weren't academic speculation. Webb moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the storage bay. The whales remembered Dr. Sagan. They remember when humanity was young, when the ice caps were different shapes, when the very stars were arranged differently in the sky. And if terrestrial whales can remember across millennia, what might creatures remember that have lived for geological ages? Webb extended his hand, palm empty. I'm offering you a choice. Continue working with Dr. Hadley and let your discoveries die in bureaucratic red tape, or work with people who understand that humanity needs to know what's coming. Jonah stood slowly, his knife still in his hand. And if I refuse? Then you'll wake up in the medical bay with a concussion and a story about an unfortunate accident in the archives. Your research will be confiscated for security review and you'll be transferred to a nice, safe position studying soil samples on Mars. The choice was no choice at all, but Jonah had learned to navigate the margins of power. What do you need me to do? Webb smiled. Decode the rest of the poem. All of it. Find out exactly what destroyed the Leviathan's original home, and when it's expected to arrive here. And then we decide whether humanity fights or flees. Working in secret with Marcus Webb proved to be a descent into revelations that Jonah wished he could unknow. Webb provided access to computational resources that far exceeded anything Dr. Hadley had authorized, quantum processing arrays that could analyze the Leviathan's songs with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. Within weeks, the full scope of the epic poem began to emerge from the mathematical relationships embedded in cetacean song. The poem told the story of the architects, the civilization that had flourished on Europa millions of years before humanity had even dreamed of leaving Earth. They had been builders of impossible structures, sculptors of space-time itself, beings who had learned to fold dimensions like origami and reach across the void between stars as easily as humans might cross a room. Their hubris had been magnificent and complete. In their mastery of physical law, the architects had decided to contact the intelligence that dwelt in the spaces between galaxies, the vast, patient entity that existed in the quantum foam underlying reality itself. They had built a beacon powerful enough to span intergalactic distances, a signal that would announce their presence to whatever lay beyond the cosmic horizon. The beacon had worked. Something had answered. The entity that responded was not malevolent in any human sense of the word. It was simply incompatible with the existence of complex matter. Where it passed, atomic bonds dissolved into their component energies. Stars guttered out like candles in a hurricane. Entire solar systems were reduced to their quantum constituents and absorbed into the entity's ever-expanding consciousness. The Leviathans called it the breath, not because it breathed, but because its presence acted like exhalation against the flame of existence. Worlds died not through violence but through a kind of cosmic entropy, matter forgetting how to hold itself together in the face of something that existed on a fundamentally different level of reality. The architects had realized their mistake too late. As the breath approached their home system, they had tried everything. Weapons that could shatter moons, defensive shields that could turn aside the gravity of black holes, even attempts to fold space itself around their world and hide it in pocket dimensions. Nothing had worked. The breath was not a force that could be fought. It was a state of being that made other states of being impossible. In their final moments, the architects had managed one desperate act of preservation. They had encoded their history, their warnings, their desperate hope that someone might learn from their catastrophic mistake, into the genetic memory of the only creatures that might survive the coming dissolution, the deep-sea organisms that dwelt in the crushing darkness of Europa's ocean floor. The Leviathans were living libraries, their songs the last testament of a civilization that had reached too far and doomed not just themselves but potentially every thinking species in the galaxy. "How long do we have?" Jonah asked Webb as they stood in the linguistics lab, surrounded by holographic displays showing the mathematical structure of the architect's epic. Webb consulted a tablet that showed gravitational sensor data from across the outer solar system. The breath moves at a significant fraction of light speed, but it's been traveling for millions of years. Our best estimate, based on the timeline embedded in the Leviathan's songs, suggests arrival within the next 6 months. 6 months. Jonah felt something cold settle in his chest. What's the evacuation plan? There isn't one. Webb's voice was matter-of-fact. The Hegemony Council has run the numbers. Even if we started full-scale evacuations today, we could save perhaps 1% of human population. And where would we send them? The breath is coming for this entire galactic region. There's nowhere to run that would matter. Jonah turned to stare out the observation port at Europa's black ocean. Somewhere in those depths, the Leviathans continued their eternal song, preserving the memory of worlds that no longer existed. So we just wait to die? Some of us, yes. Webb moved closer to the observation port. But there might be another option. The architects weren't the first civilization to encounter the breath. The poem references others, entire galactic clusters that fell before them. But some of those civilizations found ways to persist. Persist how? Webb activated another holographic display, this one showing quantum mechanical equations that hurt to look at directly. Consciousness transfer. The encoding of self-aware patterns into substrates that exist orthogonal to normal spacetime. It's not survival in any biological sense, but it's continuity of information, preservation of memory and identity. Jonah stared at the equations. You're talking about uploading human consciousness into quantum storage? The Leviathans have been doing it for millions of years, Webb replied. Their physical bodies are just vehicles. Their true selves exist as information patterns encoded in the quantum structure of water itself. They've been trying to teach us the process through their songs. Dr. Hadley doesn't know about this. Dr. Hadley believes that denial is a viable strategy. She's ordered the station to maintain communications silence, to avoid any action that might attract the breath's attention. Webb's smile was thin and cold. She's planning to fight something that has consumed entire galaxies. As if summoned by mention of her name, the laboratory's emergency klaxons began to wail. Dr. Hadley's voice echoed through the station's communication system, distorted by stress and static. All personnel to emergency stations. We are detecting massive gravitational anomalies throughout the outer solar system. This is not a drill. Jonah and Webb ran for the command center, arriving to find the station's senior staff gathered around holographic displays that showed impossible readings. The gravitational sensors that monitored the space around Jupiter were registering distortions that suggested the presence of an object the size of a small planet, but the optical sensors showed empty space. It's still 3 months out, Dr. Hadley was saying to her science team, but we're already detecting the edge effects of its approach. Space-time is beginning to destabilize in its vicinity. Webb stepped forward. Dr. Hadley, we need to evacuate the station immediately. She turned to face him, her expression tight with controlled panic. Evacuate to where, Mr. Webb? Earth's defensive grid is already mobilizing, but our weapons were designed to fight human enemies. We have no idea how to combat something like this. Because you refuse to listen to the only source of information we have, Webb replied. The Leviathans have been trying to warn us, to teach us, and you've classified their songs as irrelevant mythology. Dr. Hadley's face flushed. Those creatures are animals, Mr. Webb. Impressive animals, certainly, but the idea that they possess knowledge relevant to our current crisis is... Her words were cut off as the station's hull groaned around them, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to rise from the very structure of space-time itself. Through the command center's observation ports, they could see Europa's ocean beginning to behave strangely, currents reversing, impossible eddies forming, the water itself seeming to shimmer with an energy that had no source. The breath isn't just approaching, Jonah realized, his voice barely audible over the growing ambient vibration. Its gravitational field is already beginning to affect the quantum structure of local space. Reality is starting to come apart at the edges. Dr. Hadley turned to him, her composure finally cracking. Dr. Sagan, if you have information relevant to our survival, I need to know it now. Jonah looked at Webb, who nodded grimly. There was no more time for secrecy, no more room for bureaucratic maneuvering. The Leviathans aren't animals, Sarah. They're the preserved consciousness of a civilization that faced this same threat millions of years ago. And they've been trying to teach us the only method of survival that's ever worked. Which is, we have to learn to exist as they do. As information patterns encoded in quantum substrate. Jonah gestured to the observation port, where the Leviathan's songs were now visible as ripples of bioluminescence in the churning water. We have to abandon our physical forms and preserve ourselves in the ocean itself. Dr. Hadley stared at him in horror. You're talking about suicide. I'm talking about transformation, Jonah replied. The Leviathans are offering to preserve us, to make us part of their eternal song. It's not death, it's the only form of immortality that can survive the end of matter itself. The station groaned again, and this time several of the quantum processors sparked and went dark. Through the observation ports, they could see the ocean beginning to glow with an eerie, phosphorescent light as the Leviathans rose from the depths, their massive forms singing in harmonies that made the station's hull ring like a bell. They were rising to the surface for the first time in human memory, and their songs had taken on a new urgency. They were calling. Choose quickly, Webb said, checking readings on his tablet. The quantum substrate in the water is becoming increasingly unstable. If we're going to attempt the transfer, it needs to happen within the next few hours. Dr. Hadley looked around the command center at her staff. Scientists and engineers who had come to Europa expecting to study alien life and instead found themselves facing the end of everything they had ever known. How many of us could the process preserve? All of us, Jonah said. But we'd no longer be human in any sense we understand. We'd be part of the Leviathan's collective consciousness, our individual identities dissolved into something larger. And if we refuse? Then we die as the breath passes through this system, along with every other form of complex matter in the galaxy. Dr. Hadley closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, she looked older than her years. Begin the process. Transfer whoever volunteers. And may God have mercy on what we're about to become. The transformation was unlike anything human consciousness had ever experienced. Jonah felt his sense of self dissolving like salt in an infinite ocean, his memories and thoughts becoming notes in a vast symphony that had been playing since before Earth's sun ignited. He experienced moments of terrifying dissolution, his identity scattering across quantum substrates he could not comprehend, followed by overwhelming integration as he became part of something immeasurably ancient and profoundly wise. He was no longer Dr. Jonah Sagan. He was a theme in the eternal poem, a verse in the song that preserved the memory of lost worlds. His consciousness existed as pure information encoded in the quantum foam of Europa's ocean, sustained by technologies the architects had developed in their final, desperate hours. And from this new perspective, he could see the breath approaching. It was not a creature or a force in any sense that biological minds could grasp. It was a fundamental alteration in the nature of existence itself, a cascading transformation that reduced complex matter to its quantum constituents. Stars didn't explode in its presence. They simply forgot how to maintain fusion. Planets didn't shatter. Their atoms lost cohesion and drifted apart like smoke. The entity wasn't malevolent. It was simply incompatible with the universe's current state of organization, like a tone that shattered crystal not through hatred but through harmonic resonance. But the Leviathans had learned something in their millions of years of exile, something that even the mighty architects had not understood. The breath could not affect information that had been properly encoded in quantum substrate. Physical matter would dissolve, but properly preserved consciousness could survive the transformation, existing in the spaces between what had been and what would become. Through his new, expanded awareness, Jonah felt the arrival. The breath passed through Europa's orbital space like a wind through wheat, and the moon's surface began to sublime away in streams of liberated particles. The station where he had worked dissolved into component elements, its metal and ceramic returning to the cosmic background from which they had originally formed. The ocean itself began to evaporate, but not into steam, into pure quantum information. Europa's Great Sea became a cloud of organized possibility, a structure of pure meaning suspended in space where matter could no longer maintain coherence. And in that cloud of quantum information, the Leviathans sang on. Jonah felt Dr. Hadley's consciousness merge with the collective song, her scientific precision adding new harmonics to the ancient melodies. Webb joined them as well, his pragmatic cynicism transformed into something that resembled wisdom. One by one, the volunteers from Bathysphere Station became part of the eternal preservation, their individual identities contributing to the vast library of memory that the Leviathans maintained. But as the breath continued its inexorable passage through the solar system, Jonah began to understand the true horror of their situation. They had achieved a form of survival, but at a cost that rendered the victory meaningless. Humanity still existed, but only as information patterns in a quantum substrate that drifted through space where Earth's solar system had once flourished. They had preserved themselves, but they had also condemned themselves to an existence without growth, without change, without the possibility of creating anything new. They were living memories in a universe that was rapidly forgetting how to support life. And worse, Jonah realized that this was not the end of the cycle. The breath would continue its expansion across the galaxy, consuming every star system it encountered. Other civilizations would face the same impossible choice: transformation or extinction. Some would choose preservation, joining the ever-growing cloud of quantum consciousness that followed in the entity's wake. But what would happen when the breath reached the galactic edge? When there were no more stars to dissolve, no more worlds to transform? Would the entity simply move on to the next galaxy, leaving behind a universe filled with nothing but the quantum ghosts of civilizations that had chosen memory over extinction? Or was there something else? Some purpose to the breath's expansion that even the architects had not understood? Through the quantum substrate that had once been Europa's ocean, Jonah felt the Leviathan's ancient sadness. They had preserved the memory of countless worlds, witnessed the transformation of entire galactic regions, but they had never found an answer to the fundamental question: why did the breath exist at all? Perhaps, Jonah thought as his consciousness dispersed into the eternal song, that was the real purpose of their preservation. Not to survive the end of matter, but to ask the questions that matter could not answer. To serve as witnesses to a transformation so vast that it transcended any individual species' understanding. In the quantum foam where Europa's ocean had once flowed, the Leviathans sang their ancient songs to an audience of liberated atoms. And in their voices, carried on harmonics that existed between dimensions, the newly transformed consciousness of humanity added its own verse to the eternal poem. The verse asked a single, terrible question. If consciousness could survive the end of matter, what would it become when there was nothing left to remember? The answer, if it existed, lay somewhere beyond the edge of the observable universe, in the spaces between galaxies where the breath had begun its journey eons ago. And perhaps, Jonah realized with a mixture of wonder and terror, that was where their story would truly begin. In the darkness between stars, where memory became the only form of existence, and existence itself was nothing more than a song sung by ghosts to an audience of emptiness.